I see. So you're having the same relationship to Edwardville that Dr. Caldwell has to the system. Is that right? So what is the present total of students here in Edwardville? And of whom, how many are minorities, percentage-wise? Okay, mostly Black or mostly Hispanic or what? Okay. Very good. Let's see. There's a woman. I don't see. Oh, what is your name? Very good. Thank you. And you are by name?
Me, I'm Howard Ash, and
Wonderful. Very good. Good.
Mind if I did a formal introduction of you?
Go right ahead.
Okay, great. First off, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are streaming via YouTube today, so we do ask that when you decide to ask a question or converse, it might be difficult to always want to get up, but the only way it'll be caught on our stream is if you're at this mic. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have a question, getting up and coming right here to ask that would be very helpful. I'm Lindy Wagner. I serve as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Inclusive Excellence Education Development here on campus, and I work with several people here at the Inclusive Excellence Education and Development Hub, or the Hub. Mr. Walter Blass here, who joins us today, brings a lifetime of experiences to us and the SIU system, so we're very excited to have him. He served in the U.S. Navy, worked as an Assistant Foreign Aid Officer in Laos and Cambodia. He's been director of the American Peace Corps in Afghanistan. He was an economist and strategic planner for AT&T, a professor at Fordham University, and a visiting professor in international institutions in France, Singapore, Mexico, and Russia. He engages with campuses and communities about a variety of topics across the United States and can truly offer insight about so many different things. So this session is our breakfast and dialogue. For those joining us via the stream, we had a little breakfast first, and now we're engaging in dialogue. If you are on the stream and you want to ask a question, please put that in the chat on YouTube, and I'll make sure that Mr. Blass gets that question in here. But today's dialogue is about being a survivor of the Holocaust. And Mr. Blass will be sharing with us not only some of his personal experiences with the Holocaust, but also what has been his experience after as a survivor and what that means for him. I know we humbly await to hear what he will share with us, and I am sure we're eager to engage in dialogue with him after he shared thoughts. So he'll speak for about 30-ish minutes. I know he's already started some really good dialogue at the back during breakfast, so feel free to continue that dialogue if you'd like. And again, I would like to welcome you, Mr. Blass, and if I can get a welcome from the audience.
Can I have a paper napkin?
Oh, of course you can. Here, we can get you. I know we took them off the shot. My apologies.
Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
Good. Okay. Can you hear me all right? Good. I was born in Germany in the northern part of the Ruhrgebiet, the industrial section of Western Germany along the Rhine River in 1930. My parents were from Vienna, both of them. My father, I think, was, someone who had no particular religious affiliation, but the family was Jewish. And certainly when Hitler came in 1933, as a category, he would fall into Jewish. My mother was more observant. She would observe the main Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur holidays. And yet, when we came to America, we had a Christmas tree. And for a while, I benefited from the fact that small children in Judaism get 8 days of presents. okay? Because there are 8 candles in the Jewish candelabra. And I thought, this is a lot better than just one day. I think I've had a very happy childhood. I have a picture somewhere of me on a tricycle and a memory, actually, of my mother saying, don't pee on the flowers, pee next to the flowers. You can fertilize the flowers, but you shouldn't hurt the blossoms. I had a girlfriend almost from the beginning because my mother and another woman were in the same birthing room when I was born. And the 2 women really got a solid friendship to the point where even after we moved to Belgium, Clairchen was almost an aunt to me. And she had a little girl who was the same age, obviously. And so there's a picture of me holding my teddy bear and Inge Zimmerman holding her doll. But that was taken after we were already in Belgium. I have a picture of my mother standing in front of an apartment building, very, very pregnant. And she had saved that picture. And when in, what was it, 1974, when I was 44, my company, AT&T, asked me to go to Germany to do some consulting. And she gave me this picture and said, you know, look for it. And so I did. And I apologize for the non sequitur. This happened later when we moved. But anyway, I went to the street in Cologne where we lived. Sure enough, there was the apartment. I could see that. No, I couldn't see the apartment. I couldn't see the apartment. I crossed over to the other side of the street and there were a couple of men there. And I said, well, where is number X? And immediately they said, sind Sie Amerikaner? Are you a German? And in my best 5-year-old kitchen German, I said, ja, ich war in Dienstag geboren. And so for that, I live now in America. But I'm looking for this apartment. He said, look at that pile of sand. That's your apartment. And your bombers did this. Of course, not a mention of who started the war in 1939. And it was Hitler. It wasn't the Allies. It wasn't America. And I mention that because it is so clear that at one level, the German spirit, what in German is called Volksgeist, has really changed. That Germans today feel a sense of shame at what was done under Hitler. For me, I don't think that evil is genetically transmitted. So when people say, well, what do you think about Germans today? I say, I have friends and I like them and they like me. And since I don't have great grandchildren yet, both of my granddaughters are in their 20s and not married, I've become the uncle to a whole bunch of these former students, friends, acquaintances, and so forth. However, I mentioned this girlfriend, Klärchen's daughter, Inge, who is the same age as me. And back in 2002, I was in Heidelberg visiting with acquaintances that I liked very much. And I had a phone number for Inge Zimmermann's son. Remember, this is now 70 years after we were born. And there was somebody in Baltimore who knew the phone numbers. So I said, where do I dial such and such? And I found the son and said, can I speak to your mother? And he said, yes, she's in a retirement home in Hanover. Why don't you call her? Here's her number. So I called her and she said, oh, I'd love to see you. I said, fine. I want a few days here in Heidelberg, and then I can come to Hanover where you are. And then she gave me the address, she gave me the phone number, all the way around. I got the ticket. I made plans to go there, then go over to the Netherlands, and visit with a former student. And the night before I was supposed to meet her, I got a call from the son. And he said, I'm sorry, but my mother doesn't want to see you. No explanation. And fortunately, by age 74, I knew enough not to say, and why? And it took me weeks to figure out why. And as you might imagine, it's very likely that what happened during the war to her and to her mother was traumatic enough that she didn't want to revisit this. What happened was that the mother was Jewish, the father was a Protestant in Cologne. The father ran a fishing supplies shop and stayed in Cologne and kept the shop open, and evidently it was not bombed. But the mother and the daughter went into some hill town in Bavaria where nobody would ask questions. And they were there for 3 years during the war. But as it was left to my imagination, and having survived the Holocaust, as the introduction mentioned, it didn't take me that long to figure out that as a woman of nearly 80 years old, she was not about to relive emotionally the turmoil of that era. And I represented that turmoil. So anyway, I had a happy life. I was an only child. And at age 5, my father asked me if I wanted to take a business trip to Brussels. And I said, sure. So he said, take your teddy bear, take a change in underwear, take your toothbrush, and we'll be back in a few days. And at the time, I was a blabbermouth already and told everybody at the railroad station what we were doing. And of course, the Nazi guards paid no attention to some stupid kid, which is exactly what my father hoped for. Because at the time, the guards were instructed not to let Jews get on the train out of the country because Hitler wanted the money. And if he had to force the people to stay in Germany, so what? So we're on the train, we get to Brussels, we get in a taxi. I have those memories, but they're very 5-year-old memories, what the coach looks like, what the iron gate looked like where we stopped. My father went inside. After 20 minutes, he came out. He said, well, there's a change in plans. You're going to stay here for 3 weeks. And when I went into the building with him and saw a pile of kids eating lunch and speaking languages that I didn't understand, French and Flemish, I must have said, no, I want to go home with you. And I think it's a tribute to my father that he and I had such a solid connection that I believed him when he said, you stay here for 3 weeks, I will get your mother out. And then we move here in Brussels to a big house where you'll have a room of your own with a beautiful view. I don't remember a thing of those 3 weeks, nothing. What I do remember is that we moved into this house. I had the 3rd floor to myself. I had a view for 20 kilometers to the hill in Waterloo where Napoleon was defeated in 1815. I was very much the only child. I had all kinds of imaginary, I called myself King Hiawatha. I would talk with my counselors all the time and so forth. I was an imaginative child. And that was a very happy life. It took me a while, it took me a year at age 5 to learn enough French to start talking with the other kids in school. That was a happy experience, in part because the teachers were intrigued to have a foreign child in the classroom. My recollection is that the King of Belgium gave me a medal, and I haven't the clue what the medal was for. And I don't have the medal because, as you will hear, I had reason to leave everything behind. But I got to know one of the guys on the street. And one day he said that he had had an argument with his parents and that he was thinking of going as a stowaway on a ship to the Belgian Congo. And he said, will you come with me? And I said, oh, sure. So, of course, I told my parents what Thierry and I were about to do. And my mother burst into tears. My father said, you're going to go as a stowaway. What are you going to eat? It takes 30 days on a ship from Antwerp to Kinshasa in the Belgian Congo. That might be a problem. He said, by the way, when you eat, you also have to go to the bathroom. And you have to drink 2 liters of water every day. So that has to go back out. How are you going to sneak into the men's room when you're stowaways? What happens when you get to the Belgian Congo? You're 8 years old, okay? You should be in school. If you're not in school, where are you going to live? Well, it didn't take him the whole of dinner to talk me out of this. But it tells you that there was a relationship here that was durable, that was going to withstand a great deal of tension. And I'm very fortunate in that regard. So everything was hunky-dory until May 10th, 1940, when Hitler invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And the history of Belgium was that in World War I, the King Albert I put up a tremendous resistance to the German armies and kept the Germans from conquering Brussels, the capital. Remember, we're talking about 2 hours on the train between Cologne and Brussels. And so I was in a position to both enjoy and I suspect not worry about what was going to happen. But on the morning of May 10th, there was a tremendous clatter. And I didn't remember anything except that 6 months before, there was an earthquake. And as you know, the roof of most houses in residential Brussels have these red shingles made of clay, baked clay. And with an earthquake, of course, these things drop like flies onto the ground and with a clatter. And that's all I remember. So I yelled, is there another earthquake? Are the roof things falling down? And as I said, the chief engineer of the company, who lived with his wife and mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law had passed away by 1940, he came up and he said, Walter, no, there's not an earthquake, there's a war. And I said, what's a war? 10-year-olds, why should I remember what a war is? I don't think I heard the word. I did hear the word about Napoleon, by the way. Napoleon was a bad guy. He started a revolution in France, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, my father wasn't at breakfast when I came down to eat. So where is he? Well, the police came and got him at 8 o'clock in the morning as an enemy alien because we had come from Germany. We had applied for Belgian citizenship. We had not passed our 5 years to become Belgian citizens. So the identity card said German. And my mother could go to the armory and talk with him, and evidently did for 4 days. On the 5th day, the men were gone. And the saying was they were put in a boxcar, and the boxcar was pushed over the frontier into France with an attitude of, you guys figure out what to do with these guys. We want to be rid of them. And so for 2 months, my mother had no idea where my father was, none. The adults, the chief engineer, his wife, and my mother had a council of war, decided we'd better get out of Dodge. So we went, left everything. The German Shepherd of the chief engineer, my teddy bear, the medal that the king had given me, everything was left. Oh, we'll be back in 2 weeks. We're going to Ostend to the Channel port. There's it's a very touristy place. There's a casino, there's a beach. So we drove there, no problem. And within a day, as an independent child, I left the hotel and I went to the beach. And there were some soldiers in uniform, and I started to chat with them. And all of a sudden, the soldier just hit me on the back, flattened me on the sand. And I was very offended. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, you see those two black spots over the channel? Those are German fighter planes. And if you were to stand up, they would kill you. So you keep your face right on the sand. And this guy saved my life, quite literally. And that was not the last of the times that someone saved my life. And when the all clear was called, I got up and I ran back into town and found my mother crying, fearing that I had perished in the attack. But we were reunited, and it became obvious in a few days that we had to get moving out of Belgium and south into France. So we had a Czech Skoda, now part of VW, got in the car and drove south. That was all right until we got to a place called Agen, which I think, did you get the map that, okay, there's a map that you can look at that traces where we drove. And Agen is 100,000 people just southeast of Bordeaux. And the Germans had captured the upper 2/3 of France and the lower 2/3 to the Spanish border, all the way to Marseille and Nice on the Mediterranean, was called unoccupied France. And the gendarme, the state policeman who stopped us and said, show me your identity cards. The moment he looked at the identity card and it said nationality German, he said, vous êtes des Boches, you're Krauts, and sent us to jail. So we're guests of the French government, as the expression goes. And I was 10, and I was the head of the family now that my father was not present. And I tried to be the guardian for my mother without understanding a word of why were we in a jail, what was going to happen. And indeed, after the gendarmes got lots and lots of refugees, and the population of the jail, grew. And after a certain point, the jailer said to my wife and to the wife of the chief engineer, I'm sending you to a concentration camp for women on the Spanish border. And my mother said, look, what you have to do, you have to do. But what will you do with my 10-year-old? Can I take me with him? And he said, lady, you're 40 years old. You're in good health. If God forbid you should have to stay in that camp the winter, your son will die. You will live, but he will die. He'll catch pneumonia, he'll catch influenza, he'll catch TB. Something will happen. Okay, that's not what you want. We will take care of your little boy. Well, he didn't know, I suspect, that the only place that he found that he could put me was a home for delinquent children. So now I warn you, anything you don't like about my behavior, my clothes, my accent, whatever, it's the fault of the French. And in fact, my mother disappeared, but I could correspond with her. And that was the lifeline psychologically for me to get letters and postcards from her until this whole thing started the 10th of May. I think we were in jail 10 days later. And then she disappeared toward the end of May. And around the 1st of July, she sent me a letter. She said she tried to call me on the phone, but it didn't work, that she now knew where her husband was, where my father was. And she didn't explain at the time, but the women were very smart. They learned that there were a lot of these men's concentration camps. So they came up with the idea of building a roster of all the women in the camp, their names, their place of birth, their married name, their married residence, some identification so that the husband say, yeah, that's my wife. And then they were males, so they could exchange these rosters. And my mother wrote me that she had found my father. She was going to go to the other side of France to get him out of his camp, and one of them would come get me. And of course, being 10 years old, I wrote back and said, no, you get me first. And she was smart enough to realize that was a no-go. Okay, she would be a lot less hampered by not having a valuable 10-year-old at her side when she was trying to negotiate this whole thing. She went to the camp. She got my father out. He came back to Agen. And by that time, I developed a terrible case of eczema. And I was already in the hospital. And yet, the veterans in the hospital treated me as though I was one of their children. I felt really welcomed by the veterans. And undoubtedly, it reminded them, 10-year-olds are 10-year-olds. It doesn't matter whether it's yours or his. So my father arrives, and of course, there's paperwork to be done. And the hospital administrator said, you owe me 17,000 francs, or about $4,000 at the time, 4,000 today's dollars. So, quite a bit of money, and most likely a bribe. I mean, who was to know whether he would deposit the money to the government of France? And the government was in Vichy, and it was quasi run by the Germans. There were German troops all over the area. They walked in Marseille, they walked in Montpellier, where we eventually moved. But there was this back and forth between my father, outraged that he was being charged 17,000 francs. And he said, look, if you bathe a 10-year-old every night and you give him decent food, they don't develop eczema. And I don't see why I should pay you for a boy that I haven't seen for 4 months. This was September. And the bureaucrat was the bureaucrat. He said, pay me or you don't get out of here. So finally, my father pulls out a checkbook, writes the check. I get the discharge papers, and we're out on the street hitchhiking to the other side of France. And somewhere on that trip, I burst out in tears and said, Daddy, Daddy, I feel terrible about costing you so much money. And he said, Walter, you're old enough to figure this out by yourself. Do you really think that the Germans would allow that much money to be sent from a bank in Brussels to a bank in Marseille in unoccupied France? Besides which, I told your mother to take all the money except what she needed for daytime purchases for a week or 2 weeks and send it to my brother in England by wire transfer, which already existed. Now what's this? Ah, okay. Okay. Okay, well, I'll wait. Boy, that's the way air raid signs worked. Okay, good, very good. Yes. We have till what, 10:15 or 10:20? Pardon? 10:50, okay. So anyway, um, will this hinder my voice? You can hear me all right? Okay. All right. So to make a long story short, we were the equipment works.
For those watching, we're having a testing. It's Tuesday morning. Sorry for the problem. It'll be done shortly.
So we're not supposed to run away. Okay. Very good. So to make a long story short, my father got out of this camp. We moved to Marseille, where all the consulates were. My father picked up a rumor that if he went to the Quaker office that the American Friends Service Committee had opened in Marseille, he could get instructions about how to get out. And I'll leave this to the question period, however long that is. That's what happened. We ended up getting a visa to the Dominican Republic, 4 pages long, strung with a Scotch tape. And then after 4 months, the vice consul offered my father 3 visas, permanent visas to the United States. And those I have the copies of. And on almost exactly a year after the war broke out, my mother and I were on a ship. We entered New York Harbor, and my father came to the dock and picked us up. So I'll stop there and let you ask questions. Great. You and the kids that I met at, where is it, Glenwood High School, they were full of questions too.
Oh,
Go
good.
ahead.
So,
You better get closer.
okay. So when you were in France, France had already been occupied? They had-
Yes, the
okay.
armistice was signed at the end of June.
Okay. So then, how did your mother get out of what she was in to be able to go to your father?
Well, this is France, and the French have a very different attitude toward women than the Americans or the Germans. So the day the armistice was signed, all the women were released by fiat. And that's when my mother had already figured out. My father was in Marseille, in Saint-Cyprien-Plage, which is the first town in France when you come through from Spain. It's the Mediterranean. There are no mountains anymore. The men were in a camp originally for the foreign fighters in Spain who were fighting Franco. And it was interesting because it was summertime. There was a lot of diarrhea. And the former inmates, the Spaniards and the foreigners who were in that camp who were liberated, offered to provide necessary things. And the doctors in the camp said, we need bones from animals, okay, which we can make into charcoal, and the charcoal will stop the runs.
Oh, my goodness.
So it was a hard time for my father, but my father told my mother there was a story going around that anyone who could come up with a solution to the problems of France would be released. So my mother said, you're an inventor, you're a patent attorney, make up something. Come on. And she knew, you know, they'd been married for 20 years almost. She knew my father, and he was very inventive. So he came up with 3 ideas. The commandant of the thing gave him a chit of paper saying, you're liberated, but you can't go further than such and such in that area.
So that was a German person that said
No,
that?
that
or
was a French.
French, okay.
French.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Somebody else. I think you have a few minutes more, right? Or I can continue. I mean, it's up to you. Okay. So anyway, we get to Marseille where the consulates were, and I was a pain in the butt. Talking about everything, telling everybody our story. And my parents were desperately trying to move from pension to pension, hotel to hotel, and not to get picked up by the police. And this little boy was really in the way. So the chief engineer, who was a Hungarian, was still in Agen because the head of the jail didn't know what to do with a Hungarian. You know, this was not the day of the internet. He couldn't look it up. Whose side were they on? And he figured, if I don't know whose side they're on, he stays. So he was still in the jail in Agen. And my father obviously wrote him, called him up, I don't know what happened, and said, do you have any suggestion of what we can do with Walter? We've got to park him someplace because he's in the way and we are moving from place to place to place. And Mr. Sereny said, yes, by all means, take him to the Tordas, a fellow Hungarian family who had 3 girls, one my age, one a year younger, and then a baby. And suddenly I was in a home with 3 sisters. And it was great. Meanwhile, my father was recaptured by the police and stuck in another concentration camp just north of Marseille because he had gone outside of the limits of what this little piece of paper, the laissez-passer, said. And my father, the French being the French, they let the women talk to the men across the fence. And my father said to my mother, there's a rumor going around that we are all going to be transferred to Gurs, where she was, up in the mountains in the Pyrenees Mountains, next to that swamp where the guard was worried about my health. And my mother instantly said, Richard, you have got to get out of here now, because once you are in Gurs, you will never get out. It's in the boonies and you will be recognized as a foreigner. And that's the end of that. And so sure enough, he scaled the fence. He hid in a garbage truck that went to Marseille. And we were on the midnight train, getting the hell out of there. So we went to Montpellier, which is Montpelier, same town, but with one L instead of two. And a relatively normal life. I joined the Cub Scouts. I went to school. I was in a reception line for the head of state, Maréchal Pétain, very famous general from World War I. I had an education. Well, I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no, because now Napoleon was a hero. Okay, how can that be? When I was in school in Belgium, he was a bad guy. Now he's a good guy. But we managed, and my mother then had to get a exit visa from the governor of the department that we were in. How much longer? Okay. And my mother went to the prefect, that was the name of the governor, préfet, for an exit visa, you know, which said that you've paid your debts, you're in good health, you have enough money to keep you going, you know, and so forth. I don't think she ever learned that the prefect had a formal notification from Vichy, from the new capital of unoccupied France, that they were never to issue an exit permit to Jewish families, period, end of discussion. And my mother, who had never set foot in a university, but was very street smart. She, on the way down, Mr. Sereny said, I have a sister in Paris. We should go to Paris and see what she can do for us. My mother said, never. Hitler is going to Paris because the Germans never conquered Paris in World War I. And he is going to prove that he's better than his predecessor, the Kaiser. And so this street smart of my mother was what enabled her day after day after day to haunt this governor. And finally he said, Mrs. Blass, if you promise on the Bible that you will never darken my doorstep again, I'll give you that damn thing. And that's how we got out. And just to tell you, typical as a 10-year-old, so we get to the frontier between Spain and, of course, there's a railroad yard and a switch engine that's moving cars around. And I said to my father, it's 3 hours before we're supposed to be on the train. Can I go on to the switch engine and watch him move the cars around? My father said, sure, ask him. The guy said, fine. So I stood there next to him, switching cars around for 3 hours. And I was delighted. You know, it was a wonderful time. And I was completely innocent of what else was going on. And by the way, I have written several chapters of this whole thing for my granddaughters and maybe great-grandchildren eventually. And I would be glad to email it to you, these chapters, early memories, the war years, the first years in America, if you're interested. So that's more or less where I wanted to go in this discussion. But I'm very glad that you came. If you have still questions. Yeah, okay.
Some of the things you're saying seem so similar to what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Yes,
I mean, it's very parallel.
very similar.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Or I know you
Well,
might
I've
talk about
gone
it
to
later.
a number of conferences where there would be either an Israeli or a representative of the Jewish community. I had the privilege Sunday evening of having two rabbis come to Dr. Caldwell's house, and we had an interesting colloquy. And you're absolutely right. Not only Ukraine, Rwanda, Bosnia, Burma, Indians, Muslims being caught on a train and being set on fire by Hindus who didn't want Muslims in the new independent India in 1947, 48. I told a story that there are 3 parallel hills in a part of rural Afghanistan. And the American ambassador said, could you explain the geology of this? I can't imagine how that is. And the guide said to the American ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, it has nothing to do with geology. It has to do with history. When Genghis Khan came through here in the year 1000, and 100 years later, his grandson, Tamerlane, both of them simply killed everything in sight. Any living thing, Genghis said, kill them. And they piled the bodies into these 3 parallel hills, 300 feet long, 100 feet high, and grass all over. And it had nothing to do with history, with geology. So you're absolutely right. It occurs to me to ask the question whether all of these religious wars of the 15th century, 16th, 17th century, the Catholic Protestant movement, and then the schisms in Judaism, the schisms in Greek Orthodox versus Roman Catholic, and then, the sort of sprinkling of Protestants, including Quakers, for example, in 1640 something. George Fox comes across with these crazy ideas of letting men and women sit in the same church at the same time. Okay, and they've kept that up. And you find evangelicals, you find all of the differences. How did this spirit of fighting, killing another religion person morph into doing it for political reasons? Okay, why are Russians killing Ukrainians when Ukrainians were once a part of Russia? And Putin is, trying to reconstruct the Soviet Empire. How do you explain that change? And I don't have a very good answer. I have some answers, but that's for another time.
Thank you for this
Thank you.
session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're taking a break. Those on YouTube will be back in about 45-ish minutes. Back streaming. Thank you for joining us. And those in the room, it is a break, but you're welcome to sign up. Maybe we'll talk for a couple minutes if Mr. Blass will have it, and then feel free to join us again for the next session. Yeah. Oh, it is SIUE, the hub YouTube channel, and it should pop up actually if you just do a quick search. I don't know the actual full link off the top of my head. Yep.
What is it called? It has to have a name. Yeah, you have to type something.
Yeah, the hub. Yeah, SIUE, the hub. Okay.
One word or two?
The hub is 2 words, and it should pop up that way.
Okay.
Yeah, and that way you can watch it. Oh, perfect. Yeah. So if you just do that, you
Okay.
can watch it from wherever.
Thank you.
And we're recording streaming, so that way once it's out there, you can watch it again. So thank you so much for coming. Yes, and thank you for your questions.
You are most welcome. Thank you for speaking up.
Oh,